Hey everyone, Jay Reale here at ebodyboarding.com. Let's talk about a hot topic these days, and that is bodyboard volume. Bodyboard volume, yes, an important measurement in the surfing world for many years. Volume, by definition, means how much space something takes up. Typically, in an item like this, you would find the volume by dunking it in a tank of water of a specific volume and finding out how much water that object displaces. In other words, how much the water rises. We don't have the luxury of having a volume tank here at ebodyboarding.com, and most of the manufacturers do not provide that information. It's really hard to get because bodyboards are mostly handmade and they're not completely made by CNC machines, which can calculate that volume. So how do we measure or quantify volume in a bodyboard? It's typically by the thickness of the board. So it's sort of a parameter that we can measure and gauge whether that board would be considered a high volume or a medium volume or a low volume bodyboard. What is the significance of volume of a bodyboard? Well, obviously, you want more buoyancy if you're a heavier rider. Therefore, a higher volume board is going to benefit you. Also, along those lines, you don't have to be a heavier rider. Maybe you're riding very small waves or weak waves, say wind swell waves. Maybe you live on one of the Great Lakes and you need a board that's got a lot of flotation to get you going on really weak wind swell waves. Well, high volume board can help you even if you're not a heavier rider. So again, back to the way we measure whether a board is high, middle, or low volume is the thickness of the board. So for example, this is a Tribe board that is very thin. It's made for a lightweight rider, a smaller rider, and I have here a micrometer. I'm going to measure the thickness of this bodyboard. So before I do that, I do want to point out that if you've been around bodyboarding as long as I have, started in 1979, all bodyboards were very thick. The original Mach 7s were like 65 millimeters thick, and that is how we measure the thickness of a board these days. Everything prior to about 2001 was maybe in that 58 to 62 millimeter range. That was a normal thickness bodyboard. Everybody rode them. So if you've been around long enough, that's what you rode. What would be now considered a high volume board was just standard bodyboard back in those days. So sometime around 2001, bodyboards got very thin. Riders wanted more responsive boards, and they were mostly lightweight, high-performance riders. So that left out the average Joe or Jill that was not super small or skinny or whatever. They started struggling with flotation and ability to catch waves more easily. And so high-volume boards kind of came into vogue sometime around 2015-ish. And now pretty much every brand has at least one or two high-volume models, including our brand Tribe. We have a few high-volume boards in our line right now. So this is one of what we would call a low-volume boards. This is in our Tribe line, the Bungee. And if I measure with the micrometer the thickness of this board is 49 millimeters thick. That is very, very, very thin. So the effective benefit of that is that it's very easy to grip because very small rails. It's going to be extremely responsive, but it doesn't have a lot of buoyancy, and it'll be harder to catch waves on because it just doesn't have the same amount of flotation. Fine if you're a lightweight rider, smaller rider, perfect board for that type of rider. We move up to, this is the Hubboard's Step Deck. This is a newer board that has thinner rails but a thicker midsection, right? So they're trying to go with more of a standard volume rail, but more buoyancy by virtue of the thicker foam in the center. Now this board, if I measure out at the rails, this is 57 millimeters thick. So that is Definitely, this is a 43-inch board. That's definitely a little bit thicker than a standard 43-inch board. And I'm going to say it's around 60 in the center. My micrometer doesn't reach that far, but around 60 millimeters in the center. So you have high volume board with medium volume rails on that one. So again, that's going to be a good board for a heavier rider. This is the Tribe Chief. We have several versions of this. This is a very popular board, particularly with the bigger riders. And this board is 61 millimeters thick. So this is a true high volume board by today's standards, but it'd be a standard volume board back in the day. But the other thing we've done is we've made this wider so that it will float a heavier rider very well. Make it easy to paddle, catch waves, and glide through the flat spots. And then finally, for the very heavy riders, the riders say around the high 200-pound range into the 300s pounds in terms of weight, this is a board we call the Tribe Tanker. This is a very thick board, and I got to stretch out the micrometer for this one. So this one is, as I measure, this one is 86 millimeters thick. So way thicker than the other boards that you've looked at. So this board's going to have a ton of buoyancy, lots of glide. Again, going to be a better board for riders closing in on 300 pounds and above. This would be a good choice. So the thing I want to point out here is for those of you looking at the potential of a high volume board, don't just assume that it's going to be too thick for you. As I pointed out, we all used to ride these boards, at least the other three that I showed you, boards of that thickness, for many, many years, and we rode them at Pipeline and all kinds of spots around the world in big surf, small surf, and everything in between before everything got thin around 2001. So this is more just like, consider it a return back to the old school thickness of boards, but now we call them high volume boards because there are thinner options. So the real key here, I think, is to be open-minded and make sure you get a board with the volume that suits your height and weight. If you're not sure which one to get, go to our website, go to the bottom and click the link that says tell me which board to get. And I will also put a link right up here at the top of the screen, so you can click on that and you can go to that form, fill it out. I'll tell you which board I think you should be riding. So that'll do it here for me bodyboarding. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into bodyboard volume. Have a great one.